Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Nick Elliott, Head of Communities at Dow Jones Risk and Research. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this latest risk webinar in our series, in which we look at one of 6 major sectors of business. So it's a monthly research series, and it's tied with some research that we released starting at the end of last year, where we delve into corporate filings and see what companies in specific sectors are saying about their own risks. Today, we're tackling manufacturing with an expert who I'm going to introduce shortly. You may have questions for him as well. And if you do, please write them in the field you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll get to those later. So now it's time to introduce Breck Weigel. He's a partner with the law firm Squire Patton Boggs. He has a long career in the law, but also previously served as Chief Compliance Officer at GE Aviation. So Breck, welcome. Thanks for joining us. The top risk that we identified in our research, and I think this resonates with what you've been hearing, is supply chain. So can you just start by, for our audience, introducing why supply chain is such a major risk for manufacturing?
Well, let me start with this. So I thought it'd be useful to start with a definition. And supply chain is a network of organizations, people, activities, information, and resources involved in the process of getting a product from its raw materials to the final customer. And that sounds fairly simple, but we all know that it's very complex. I would agree 100% that supply chain poses the most significant risk for manufacturers. And the fact that it is at the top of everybody's risk assessment certainly validates the significance of the risk of compliance. Why is it important? There's a bunch of reasons why it's important, but supply chain success or failure influences the bottom line of profit. The goal is to manufacture quality, get it out the door, and get paid. So it's kind of critical for manufacturers who have supply chains to be certain that you've got all of your people in the right place. You talk about tone from the top, and that's really important in a supply chain sort of world. You need efficient operations, timely delivery, cost control, safety, quality, customer satisfaction, all of those things that we know is important. And it's important not just to look at your own performance, but to look at the performance of your suppliers. Are they doing what they need to do? Are they getting, product on time? What's the level of frustration? Is there customer satisfaction? Are they impacting, your cash targets? But the bottom line is executives must focus heavily on supply chain for the simple reason that it's extraordinarily complex and a key indicator of success. So, it may require managing hundreds, if not thousands, of suppliers at the senior level of the company. Supply chain challenges are felt everywhere in the business. If you look across, I think everybody in the manufacturing company has access to and involvement with the supply chain probably on a weekly basis. Look at not just the supply chain group, but product development, marketing, sales, operations, finance, privacy, aftermarket, and legal and compliance. So that's kind of the significance of supply chain.
So there's a whole lot residing in there. Now, supply chain caught people's attention during the pandemic when we had all these snags and delays and prices of basic goods going up. But one of the interesting things you told me ahead of this event is that some of those snags are still there, and there's actually a lot of tension these days between companies and their suppliers. Can you explain what's going on there?
Yeah, so there's two things here. One is it's a caveat. To be fair, of all the disruption that we see in supply chain right now is a result to some degree of the lingering effects of COVID, and we call it the COVID hangover. COVID impacted the entire globe, no doubt about it. Inflation remains high today. Many employees never returned to the workforce. A lot of people either retired or they stayed at home, and as a result, we have pretty significant shortage of qualified labor in the United States. Decreased quantities of raw materials because of high demand. long lead times, scheduling, forecasting, and all of this causes disruption. And as a result, what we've seen as we have moved out of the pandemic, but certainly has not gone away, is kind of what I would call a blame game. And by that, I mean, COVID brought a lot of tension between manufacturers and suppliers in the middle of ongoing supply chain disruptions, transportation delays, price increases, again, workforce shortages, as well as inflation and high interest rates. Interesting point is that there 75% of suppliers have encountered disputes since the pandemic. That's great for lawyers, but that's really a stunning number.
Yeah.
And so we see financial failures and bankruptcies still across, the supply chain. There's reasons to be concerned if, in fact, it's a sole source supplier. You have to make decisions about whether or not you're going to support that supplier, whether or not you'll invest in the longevity of the supplier. Do things like include payments up front. But what we've seen both during COVID and since COVID, and I do a fair amount of litigation associated with suppliers and manufacturers, is that suppliers have adopted on occasion aggressive and unilateral legal approaches to the situation. And specifically, they basically threaten, we're going to go out of business unless you give us price and terms. And so what we ended up seeing since COVID is a kind of a rash of litigation. And there's really two sides of the coin. One was the supply side, and the other is the manufacturing side. And on the supply side, basically a strategy for them was force majeure, which of course is the unforeseeable circumstances that will prevent you from fulfilling your contract. So you think about tornadoes and hurricanes and so forth. But the suppliers here basically argued in a number of cases that in order to meet contractual delivery dates or quality requirements, they couldn't do it because of shortage of workers. And what the case law basically says is if suppliers, basically they threaten price and deliveries, but the clause has to be specific. So it's like the clause would be tornadoes and hurricanes. That's force majeure. You have the ability as a supplier to hire workers when and how you can. And so courts basically did not rule in favor of the suppliers there, but they ruled in favor of the manufacturers. The manufacturers, on the other side, argued essentially with an injunction strategy, which basically is restrain the activities of others. Suppliers are demanding a unilateral price increase. They refuse to deliver product. They go into court, they ask for an injunction, and a lot of courts said that the manufacturers would suffer irreparable harm if they couldn't rely upon their supplier and for real-time requirements of its own contracts. And in many cases, there were sole source providers. So the court seemed to be sympathetic to the manufacturers. I'm not saying it's a 90-10. It's, obviously both sides win and lose, but those are kind of the key arguments that have been made. But we're going to see a whole lot more additional claims. So I would say stay tuned.
Yeah, very interesting. So that's obviously one risk that manufacturers are dealing with, and a big one. What are some of the other risks, some of the other leading risks you think reside in manufacturing?
Yeah, so up front, we're looking at supply chain as a risk in and of itself to the entire enterprise. So what we're looking at now is the next level down. And so you and I have had this discussion, and I identified 5 different risks. You could probably pick out 25. So This is not, there's certainly many risks that could come to mind. But the first one I had was concentration of suppliers. And by that, I mean, because you've had all of these difficulties in the supply chain, you now have smaller shops, sole source, competitive manufacturers. You see more quality escapes. You see lack of experience, lack of qualified labor, and all of that results in delay in costs. So that would be the first one. The next one I would say is scarcity. And again, this is coming back to COVID. There's delays in availability, declining raw materials, forgings, long lead times, and rising costs. And again, I tie that back to COVID. The next one identified was climate change. And this really is a billion-dollar disaster. And we see it all the time. It's wreaking havoc on supply chain production. Again, tornadoes, floods, fires, droughts. And this isn't just California. And it isn't just Asheville, North Carolina. It is between California. It's between both coasts.
Yeah.
So we see a lot of that, that there is, risk from climate. And, production facilities are really at significant risk.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
I've seen it just get worse over the last few years. The other ones I asked, the other ones I included cybersecurity.
Mm-hmm.
It is not unique to supply chain, but it's a growing trend across every function of manufacturing. And it's inadvertently allowing malicious actors to infiltrate a supply chain and get a lot of information off of that. And no one is immune in this. The risk is very significant that, but again, not just supply chain. And then finally is international supply chains and geopolitical risk. And we can perhaps have a discussion about that a little bit later. But if you think about it, it's really a vulnerability of global supply networks to disruptions caused by political activity, political instability, conflict, sanctions, and so forth. And just as an example, consider China, Turkey, and India. All of those countries have set up, they host significant U.S. and Western supply chain factories. And China, there are concerns out there in terms of their ethical practices, economic espionage, which we've had that just here in Southwest Ohio. Political demands, threatening enemies like Taiwan. And then you look at Turkey and India, who have what some people think are disturbing relationships of concern. China and Russia, very tight there. So these all raise real concerns and drive interest by manufacturers to move supply chain to more stable locations.
Yeah, and sometimes those stable locations are hard to find, aren't they? And two of the countries you mentioned, some companies have moved supply chains out of China and are looking at India, but as you mentioned, there can be issues with India as well.
Right. Yeah. So I think when back in 2018 or 17, whatever it was, when Trump had the tariffs, 2019 tariffs on China led to many companies moving production out of China.
Yeah.
And they went to Singapore, Vietnam, and Malaysia, which are not ideal, but they're much more stable, I think. And I would say that it's not surprising that they would move out there. Trump administration really wanted them to relocate in the U.S. I don't think that happened at the degree they wanted it to. But China remains a very strategic competitor to the U.S.
Yeah. So I do want to draw on your compliance experience again. Breck, for the audience, Breck was Chief Compliance Officer at GE Aviation. So as you look at this list of risks, Breck, how should compliance teams be thinking about managing them? What are some of the best practices in supply chain compliance?
Yeah, so it's the nature of your business that drives the framework of your compliance program. And there is no one size that fits all in compliance. I learned that early on, and it just depends on what it is that you do. Consider the nature of the business. You could be a defense contractor selling jet engines across the globe, or you could be a uniform manufacturer. You're going to have very different priorities. Your program's going to have different structures, rhythms, policies, procedures, and you really need to rely upon what are the stakeholder expectations. And so you and I discussed, best practices, and this gets, maybe even out of the manufacturing world a little bit. But I came up with 4 of them. And the first one I would say is probably very well known to this audience to the extent it's a compliance group. But you need to pay close attention to the Department of Justice's evaluation of corporate compliance programs. I'm sure that many on the phone are aware of that. Some aren't. But it basically goes back to 2017, and I think it's an extraordinary resource. As a practitioner in compliance, it really gives you a great roadmap in terms of what to do and what not to do. And it's updated almost annually. The entire evaluation is like 25 pages. But these expectations are relied upon by the regulators to determine whether or not they will bring charges against a company.
Yeah.
Think about Boeing, what they've been through in the last, 18 months. And this is their digest, and this is what they rely upon. At the same time, I think it's very valuable. First they have expectations. First and foremost, they insist on an annual risk assessment and abatement plan, which I think every compliance person does. Concern reporting and investigations, which I think is probably the most significant piece of compliance in terms of addressing your own employees in terms of what's right and what's wrong, and really being good citizens. Policies, procedures, and communications, which are uniform. Periodic evaluation, extending requirements. Policies, procedures, communication. We talked about that. Effective training, and then periodic evaluation, extending requirements. For example, the guidance recently was updated in 2024, and each time they update it, they bring in other topics. So most recently, it's whistleblowers, data analysis, culture, lessons learned, and staffing and resources. And supply chain is on their list, and it's really worth reading. And it isn't. I don't view this as something that it's Big Brother trying to take our jobs away from us. I think it's a very helpful sort of process. So that's what I would say on that. The next is the thing I say is a best practice is to train your senior leaders. And again, I mentioned early on, tone from the top, but make them your compliance people. Focus them on communications. I think about when I was in the role, we would have a quarterly, all hands. I was the first one on the stage, and our CEO demanded that the compliance go first. We did quarterly videos, myself and the CEO. We did a lot of communications just to the employee group generally. But really the idea is to have your non-compliance people to be advocates and be committed spokespeople and take it very, very seriously. And that will always serve you well with regulators should you be in a tough spot.
And would that include if your supply chain specialists in the company as well? So such as if you have a chief supply chain officer or a head of supply chain?
Absolutely. So, we had, 15 items on the risk assessment. And during the year, we would go through and either have, a fireside chat or some sort of video or some sort of, joint communication.
Yeah, that's good advice.
And the next one is embrace data and statistics. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm a huge fan of open reporting. I just think it's one of the most critical pieces of the entire program. And it's really key in terms of, determining signs of healthy programs, including supply chain. And when you think about supply chain, you got to be thinking about investigating every single quality escape that you have. And, if you're a defense contractor, you've got False Claims Act exposure. And so it's really important that all of these issues go through the open reporting process. And, separately, evaluate and improve on the data and statistics that come out of your reporting processes. And by that, I mean, you're able to demonstrate the effectiveness of your open reporting. So if you think about you want the maximum number of concerns filed. That shows you that your employees are comfortable. You want a low anonymous rate. Again, people are comfortable. Corrective actions are high. You're making use of the information that you get, and the confirmation rate is high. And so you can go back, and I've studied this a lot in a lot of companies, and they have different ups and downs. But I just think that's something to strive for.
And are Are there any specific data points that you think are especially valuable when it comes to supply chain risk? Anything in that vein?
Yeah. So are you talking about the supply chain risk I already?
Yeah, if you're, I mean, because you would have the company itself, but you may, as you mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, you get companies with hundreds of thousands of suppliers sometimes. Is there any specific data that companies should be looking to get from those suppliers as an indication of the robustness of their compliance performance, for example?
Yeah, as I said early on, I mean, you've really got to get engaged with your supplier, and I think there's no reason or no that why you can't get deep into their processes. You know, what is their compliance program look like?
Yeah.
What does their employee base look like? You know, where do they have a lot of litigation? Do they have problems with regulators and so forth? So I think that's all fair game.
Okay, great.
And then the last thing I was going to add in this is, you know, get the business people involved in compliance. And compliance, I think, is a team sport. Enlist individuals from the business who best understand the risks and will own the risks. So, for example, if you're looking at a significant role to address in terms of, you know, some sort of, let's say, supply chain, that person should be leading that with support from compliance as opposed to the other way around. So they have skin in the game, and they're involved with policies and procedures, and they become really responsible as a risk focal. And that's how we operated in my prior role. And so there were, as I said, 15, 16, 17 risk assessment topics. There would be a business person responsible for each individual one.
That's very interesting. Yeah. So for the audience, we have a few minutes left, and I have some more questions for Brett. But if you have questions, just a reminder that you can write them into the Q&A field that you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen. We did get a question from Mitch asking about the resources that Breck had mentioned. So we can send you the link to the Justice Department guidance afterwards. We can do that following the webinar, Mitch. But feel free to ask other questions. Now, Breck, I wanted to turn to something that's very topical, and that's tariffs. Where do those fit into the risk picture, do you think, for manufacturers?
Great question. And as you said, you know, it's obviously very relevant at the moment. We're seeing, hearing a lot about it. No one's surprised when, President Trump returned that we were going to hear about this. The question is, does it exacerbate the supply chain issues? My sense is likely yes, depending on what it is, what you're doing. But I would say in some form or another, almost always there's going to be some sort of, difficulty for supply chain. At a minimum, tariffs can be disruptive. Investors and economists don't like them. They oppose them. They figure it just passes along higher costs to customers, and the risk of further inflation. If you think about tariffs, the objectives really are bring production home, raise revenue, gain leverage, and it doesn't always work that way. And in fact, it can result in retaliation and disruption. So it is a fine line.
Yeah.
And timing is very relevant with the incoming administration. He defines tariffs as the greatest thing ever invented. We'll see about that, but it's, they're asserting that tariffs are a need to balance the trade inequalities. What's happening here, and it's pretty clear to most people, and the media certainly is reporting on it, is that the landscape right now appears to be more about threats than it is about changing, frequently in terms of tariffs. And previously it was 10% to 60%, and that was going to be Mexico, Canada, and China. We really haven't heard anything about it. The question is, how far will the administration go? Will they modify the strategy? And to some degree, it's getting pretty apparent. It's pretty much a negotiating tool. And I think most of us saw over the weekend the dialogue with Colombia and the requirement that they accept deportees And they did that under the threat of tariffs. And once they agreed to accept the deportees, they pulled the tariff threat. So, I mean, it's kind of, we'll see how it plays out. I mean, who knows? I mean, are there going to be actual tariffs? Who knows?
Yeah. It seems to be a very fluid area, doesn't it? Easy segue though into the topic of geopolitics, which we touched on earlier when you were talking about China and India and Turkey, and it also was one of the risks that we looked at in our research report. It's a tricky area for companies to navigate, though, isn't it? But there is a heavy overlap here with supply chain. So, how have you seen companies thinking about that intersection between geopolitics and supply chain?
To be candid, I haven't had a lot of clients that have had to go through this. But the reality is, we talk about nearshoring or friendshoring. I mentioned that Trump had, caused certain people to leave China back in 2019. These are difficult decisions for any company. You got to be careful what you ask for, because disruptions, to the supply chain can be inevitable on any move.
Yeah.
And you really got to think about it. I totally understand, and I think people understand what the geopolitical risk is, the need for safety and quality, shedding light on the need to diversify the supply base, alternative suppliers, and so forth. But sometimes you can be too late to avoid the worst impacts. So timing is a big deal. And it's, you've got to really think about it, sit back and make sure you've done it in the right way. It requires long-term planning, avoid making it matters worse, and redundant factories are what a lot of manufacturers want. But that's difficult, and it's it's expensive, and it's a luxury that you really have to think hard about. Is it really needed? It's ideal for everybody. It's what everybody wants, but it's very difficult. And then the last thing, in terms of time and expense of managing the risk, it's years to move, years to build, years to recruit, onboard talent, due diligence, and so forth, and a huge outlay of capital. So my only point is you have to be very, very careful and thoughtful about when you do it.
Yeah, it's not at all an easy undertaking to shift your lines of supply. I think we've got time for one more topic. If we could just touch on it briefly, Breck, and that's sanctions and export controls. This is another area that's been very active for companies generally, including an issue for manufacturers. And there's obviously a connection here with geopolitical events and rivalry with China and so on. Do you have any thoughts about the risk here and how companies might be thinking about it?
Yeah, so, sanctions and export controls are very powerful. And, they influence the behavior of nations and restrict the export of goods and technology. And that's a big deal. Now, while they can be effective in achieving U.S. goals, they too can create enormous hurdles and disruption in the global supply chains. There can be delivery disruption where a supplier under sanctions is unable to fulfill orders, leading, of course, to delays. Even if there is access to the market, it can still be very difficult to operate in those markets. If you think about the existence of sanctions and complicated processes, you're going to run into difficulty, for example, in payment requirements. A lot of financial institutions get very sketchy. You are concerned about this, even when the transaction is legitimate. So
yeah,
the determination of what you can do and what you can do, what you can't do and what you can do is very, very complicated. And that's why, a lot of companies have big groups that are responsible for due diligence on both, export controls, heavy on that, as well as on sanctions. So it's critical that you have a good compliance program. I mean, it's really mandatory. And I remember going back, maybe we had one person that did this. Well, today it's like a 10-person group.
Yeah.
20-person group. So it's heavy due diligence on that. And you really need to understand the entire landscape and have true professionals and true experts in the area.
And on that note, we have run out of time. So, Breck, thank you so much for joining us and sharing the benefits of your expertise and experience. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Look out for the recording of this that we'll be providing afterwards, and also for our future webinars in this series. The next one coming up in roughly 4 weeks' time is on the payments industry, and then we'll be tackling pharmaceuticals after that. So thanks again for joining us. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks, everybody.